Natural building wall systems is the subject of this class, and I'm really excited to share with y'all about it because it's something very near and dear to my heart. I'm really into natural building, and typically in this country nowadays, natural buildings tend to have metal roofs because they just last a really long time and are relatively easy to install. There are natural built roof systems, but that's something that will be covered in the roofing or roof system class. And then there are various natural foundations, including the rubble trench foundation, and that will be covered in the foundations class. So right now we're just focused on naturally built wall systems, which is what most people think of when people think of natural building in this country. And so natural building is different from green building. So natural building is generally using materials that are natural, that haven't gone through much as far as industrial processes. There are some exceptions to that. And it often includes materials that are local to the building site. That's not always true, but it's often true. Green building, on the other hand, has to do with super energy efficient buildings. And so the energy efficiency in those green buildings is often accomplished using very highly industrial and highly technical materials that have been largely created in factories and often created using mechanizations and systems that are not actually environmentally friendly at all, but they make a very energy efficient building. And energy efficiency is something that's really important this day and age, especially when you look at the way that energy consumption is controlled by what's being used at the point of use, like at individual houses. Like it has a much bigger effect on how much energy is actually used than how efficient making the energy is. And that's for another class, that discussion, but we'll just leave it at that it's really important to change the point of use. And so having super energy efficient buildings is really important, especially if they're going to be consuming grid power. If they're going to be off grid and if you're heating with wood and things like this, it's not necessarily as vital for climate change because you are creating kind of a closed loop system. So these natural buildings may be very energy efficient. For example, straw bale is really insulative. But they might be a little less efficient than some of these green buildings. But when you look at like the total lifespan of the building and how much energy is consumed for that building to be built, and then for the building to be able to be sustained over time, you will often find that the natural buildings have a much lower ecological footprint than the green buildings. So that's something that I've been really interested in. I took a class actually recently on some building science, which is a fascinating topic and gets a little more nerdy and advanced than some of the classes that we're offering here. But I was really fascinated and excited to see, and it was up at Yestermorrow in Vermont, which is an excellent school, by the way. And I was really excited and intrigued to see that green building people, and especially in Europe, I think this is happening faster, are starting to look at the materials that they're using for their construction and having like a self-critical view within the green building world, looking at what goes into making those materials, a lot of which are foams and like have a lot of embedded energy in them. And so they're starting to look at alternatives, and they're looking to natural building oftentimes to be able to figure out and find some sort of material that can be produced on an industrial scale, but which uses materials which are much more natural and less processed, less industrial, and have a smaller embedded ecological footprint. And so they're looking to using more natural materials in some of these green building things. So we'll see. It'll probably take 5 or 10 years for that to then get over to this side of the Atlantic. We're based in the US. So we'll see how long it takes for those to get here and for those products to become economical. But especially in Germany right now, they're doing a lot within the green building movement to kind of move it towards more natural and reducing the ecological footprint. So, we're going to be talking about all these different types of naturally built wall systems. And so one of the first things that I want to clarify, and something that we go back and forth talking about whether something is high in this or high in that, and it has importance. I'm leading you somewhere, just trust me. So we're going to look at thermal mass and insulation. So thermal mass is something that has a lot of mass, like a rock. And if you put a rock in the sun, the rock will heat up. And then if you bring the rock inside, the rock will give its heat over time. Or if you sit on the rock, if it's a giant boulder and it gets heated up by the sun over the day, and you sit on the rock is going to give you heat, which is very nice at times. If you go to a rock and it's kind of been a cold night and you sit on the rock, it's going to take the heat out of your body, which is not what you want. The same thing can happen with buildings. So in places where there's a big fluctuation in temperature between the nighttime and the daytime, so like in the United States, the desert Southwest is a really good example of that. It could be like 50 degrees at night and 90 degrees during the day. Like it's this huge shift between nighttime and daytime temperatures. So really the best thing for creating a wall system in that sort of climate is to have something that's going to regulate the temperature. And that's what the thermal mass does. It's going to make it cooler during the day and make it warmer during the night. So it's like a nice, comfortable, let's say 70-ish degrees all day long, which would be pretty awesome if it's 50 at night and 90 during the day. So that makes a lot of sense for places that have like those big ranges of temperatures. Now, if you live somewhere where you're either wanting to keep the heat in or you're wanting to keep the heat out, then you want to be looking more towards a wall system that is more insulative rather than being a thermal mass. And so straw bale is a really good example of an insulative material. There's also a lot of conventional materials that are very insulative. I'm sure y'all are probably familiar with fiberglass insulation. Relatively insulative. Foam is very insulative. If you put foam in the sun, it's not going to absorb the heat of the sun in the same way that a rock does. If you have a cooler, that's another really good example of insulation, although many coolers don't have that great of insulation, especially on the top, which is where it matters the most. But let's say a Yeti cooler, which I have yet to buy a Yeti cooler because they're very expensive, but they're very high quality. And so what that does is it keeps heat from transferring. And so if you live somewhere where it is, let's say, negative 30 like at night and then negative 10 during the day, you're going to just want to keep a fire going or have some other source of heat, which might be passive solar, all day long. And you're all night long, and you're not going, maybe the fire can go out occasionally, but you want to have the heat inside and the cold outside, and you want to insulate yourself from your surroundings. And so that is when you want to have an insulative wall system. It's a similar thing like if you live in South Florida, and let's say during the day it's 95 degrees, and at night it's 85 degrees, and you happen to be running air conditioning, which has all sorts of implications. Air conditioning is such an energy suck. But if you are going to be running air conditioning, you want to have a good amount of insulation because you don't want the heat from the outside coming into your conditioned space. And so in that situation, also, you want to have an insulated wall. You might also, if you're living in South Florida, choose to not use air conditioning and instead really focus on ventilation and all sorts of other systems, and in which case you would not want insulation. But let's just say that you are using air conditioning, then having an insulated space can be very helpful. So yeah, here in North Carolina, in the mountains of North Carolina, we tend to either experience temperatures that are warm in the night and hot during the day, which this time of year, I think it's like in the 70s at night, maybe the upper 60s, and then it gets up to the 80s. And so, and that is not a situation where thermal mass is super helpful. And in the wintertime, I'm experiencing temperatures usually anywhere between like, I mean, they can really dip down. Like we can get to -5, not super often, but usually it's like between 20 and 40 degrees. So that sort of range doesn't really call for thermal mass. That calls more for insulation, just like we explored if we're like in Wisconsin or in Vermont or Alaska or places like that. Whereas the desert Southwest really calls for a mediation, and that's when we want thermal mass. There are other times when we want thermal mass, not necessarily in our walls, but like in our floors when we are using passive solar design. But that is another class. But in our wall systems, it can be nice, even if you have an insulated wall system, to have thermal mass on the inside of your wall system, because that thermal mass on the inside, if you heat up the room with a wood stove or some other way, that's going to hold on to the heat. It's going to take a little bit longer for the room to heat up, but then it's going to hold that thermal mass, which here is the chinking or the plaster on the inside of my chinking. There's an insulative layer in this wall system between the inside and the outside, and then there's this layer of clay on the inside. I also have stone countertops in here, and so those all act as a thermal mass. And then if I have heat in the cabin, that can really help with regulating the temperature. So if the fire goes out, the thermal mass is going to be feeding heat into the room for quite some time after the fire goes out. So if you are doing a combination of insulation and thermal mass, it's best to have the thermal mass on the inside of the building always, and then to have the insulation on the outside of the thermal mass, which is not necessarily the easiest thing to do if you're building with conventional construction, but just so you know, that's like pretty ideal. So we are going to discuss the pros and cons of various natural built wall systems. And so we're going to go through all of these different types of wall systems. We're going to talk about adobe. We're going to talk about rammed earth. We're going to talk about earth bag. We're going to talk about slip straw. We're going to talk about log cabins. We're going to talk about cordwood, and we're going to talk about a bunch of other ones. So it's going to be really exciting. And we're going to start, as we're like going through these, we're going to start with materials that are more thermal mass materials, like adobe and like rammed earth. And then we're going to be moving through like somewhat insulative, somewhat thermal mass materials, and then we're going to be moving into like really insulative materials. So like like straw bale is going to be a very insulative material. So I hope you enjoy our journey together.